The Dawnbreakers, Nabal's narrative recorded for the handicapped, tape 8. No sooner had the Bab left the bath than the people of Urumiyeh rushed to take away, to the last drop, the water which had served for his ablutions. Great excitement prevailed on that day. The Bab, as he observed these evidences of unrestrained enthusiasm, was reminded of the well-known tradition commonly ascribed to the Imam Ali, the commander of the faithful, which specifically referred to Azerbaijan. The lake of Urumiyeh, that same tradition asserts in its concluding passages, will boil up, will overrun its banks, and inundate the town. When he was subsequently informed how the overwhelming majority of the people had spontaneously arisen to proclaim their undivided allegiance to his cause, he calmly observed, "Think men that when they say, 'we believe,' they shall be let alone and not be put to the proof." This is a quote from the Quran 29:2. This comment was fully justified by the attitude which that same people assumed towards him when the news of the dreadful treatment meted out to him in Tabriz reached them. Hardly a handful among those who had so ostentatiously professed their faith in him persevered in the hour of trial in their allegiance to his cause. Foremost among these was Mullah Imam Vardi, the tenacity of whose faith no one except Mullah Jalil-i Urumi, a native of Urumiyeh and one of the Letters of the Living, could surpass. Adversity served but to intensify the ardor of his devotion and to reinforce his belief in the righteousness of the cause he had embraced. He subsequently attained the presence of Baha'u'llah, the truth of whose mission he readily recognized, and for the advancement of which he strove with the same vivid earnestness that had characterized his earlier strivings for the promotion of the cause of the Bab. In recognition of his long-standing service, he, and also his family, were honored with numerous tablets from the pen of Baha'u'llah, in which he extolled his achievements and invoked the blessings of the Almighty upon his efforts. With unflinching determination, he continued to labor for the furtherance of the faith until past 80 years of age, when he departed this life. The tales of the signs and wonders which the Bab's unnumbered admirers had witnessed were soon transmitted from mouth to mouth, and gave rise to a wave of unprecedented enthusiasm which spread with bewildering rapidity over the entire country. It swept over Tehran and roused the ecclesiastical dignitaries of the realm to fresh exertions against him. It trembled at the progress of a movement which, if allowed to run its course, they felt certain would soon engulf the institutions upon which their authority, nay, their very existence depended. They saw on every side increasing evidences of a faith and devotion such as they themselves had been powerless to evoke, of a loyalty which struck at the very root of the fabric which their own hands had reared, and which all the resources at their command had as yet failed to undermine. Tabriz in particular was in the throes of the wildest excitement. The news of the impending arrival of the Bab had inflamed the imagination of its inhabitants, and had kindled the fiercest animosity in the hearts of the ecclesiastical leaders of Azerbaijan. These alone, of all the people of Tabriz, abstained from sharing in the demonstrations with which a grateful population hailed the return of the Bab to their city. Such was the fervor of popular enthusiasm which that news had evoked, that the authorities decided to house the Bab in a place outside the gates of the city. Only those whom he desired to meet were allowed the privilege of approaching him. All others were strictly refused admittance. On the second night after his arrival, the Bab summoned Azim to his presence, and, in the course of his conversation with him, asserted emphatically his claim to be none other than the promised Qaim. He found him, however, reluctant to acknowledge this claim unreservedly. Perceiving his inner agitation, he said, "Tomorrow I shall, in the presence of the Wali Ad, which is the heir to the throne, and in the midst of the assembled ulamas and notables of the city, proclaim my mission. Whoso may feel inclined to require from me any other testimony besides the verses which I have revealed, let him seek satisfaction from the Qaim of his idle fancy." I have heard Azim testify to the following. That night I was in a state of great perturbation. I remained awake and restless until the hour of sunrise. As soon as I had offered my morning prayer, however, I realized that a great change had come over me. A new door seemed to have been unlocked and set open before my face. The conviction soon dawned upon me that if I were loyal to my faith in Mohammed, the Apostle of God, I must needs also unreservedly acknowledge the claims advanced by the Bab, and must submit without fear or hesitation to whatever he might choose to decree. This conclusion allayed the agitation of my heart. I hastened to the Bab and begged his forgiveness. "It is a further evidence of the greatness of this cause," he remarked, "that even Azim, which literally means great, should have felt so exceedingly troubled and shaken by its power and the immensity of its claim. Rest assured," he added, "the grace of the Almighty shall enable you to fortify the faint in heart, and to make firm the step of the waverer. So great shall be your faith, that should the enemy mutilate and tear your body to pieces, in the hope of lessening by one jot or tittle the ardour of your love, he would fail to attain his object. You will, no doubt, in the days to come, meet face to face him who is the Lord of all the worlds, and will partake of the joy of his presence." These words dispelled the gloom of my apprehensions. From that day onward, no trace of either fear or agitation ever again cast its shadow upon me. The detention of the Bab outside the gate of Tabriz failed to allay the excitement which reigned in the city. Every measure of precaution, every restriction which the authorities had imposed, served only to aggravate a situation which had already become ominous and menacing. Haji Mirza Akazi issued his orders for the immediate convocation of the ecclesiastical dignitaries of Tabriz in the official residence of the governor of Azerbaijan, for the express purpose of arraigning the Bab and of seeking the most effective means for the extinction of his influence. Haji Mullah Mahmud, entitled the Nizamul Ulama, who was the tutor of Nasir-i-Din Mirza and Vali Ad, Mullah Muhammad-i Mamakani, Mirza Ali Ashgar, the Sheikhul Islam, and a number of the most distinguished sheikhs and doctors of divinity were among those who had convened for that purpose. Nasir-i-Din Mirza himself attended that gathering. The presidency belonged to the Nizamul Ulama, who, as soon as the proceedings had begun, in the name of the assembly commissioned an officer of the army to introduce the Bab into their presence. A multitude of people had meanwhile besieged the entrance of the hall, and were impatiently awaiting the time when they could catch a glimpse of his face. They were pressing forward in such large numbers that a passage had to be forced for him through the crowd that had collected before the gate. Upon his arrival, the Bab observed that every seat in that hall was occupied except one, which had been reserved for the Vali Ad. He greeted the assembly, and without the slightest hesitation proceeded to occupy that vacant seat. The majesty of his gait, the expression of overpowering confidence which sat upon his brow, above all, the spirit of power which shone from his whole being, appeared to have for a moment crushed the soul out of the body of those whom he had greeted. A deep and mysterious silence suddenly fell upon them. Not one soul in that distinguished assembly dared breathe a single word. At last, the stillness which brooded over them was broken by the Nizamul Ulama. "Who do you claim to be?" he asked the Bab, "and what is the message which you have brought?" "I am," thrice exclaimed the Bab, I am the promised one. I am the one whose name you have for 1,000 years invoked, at whose mention you have risen, whose advent you have longed to witness, and the hour of whose revelation you have prayed God to hasten. Verily I say, it is incumbent upon the peoples of both the East and the West to obey my word and to pledge allegiance to my person. No one ventured to reply except Mullah Muhammad Imam Mamakani, a leader of the Shaykhi community, who had been himself a disciple of Sayyid Qazim. It was he on whose unfaithfulness and insincerity the Sayyid had tearfully remarked, and the perversity of whose nature he had deplored. Sheikh Hassan Izanuzi, who had heard Sayyid Qazim make these criticisms, recounted to me the following. I was greatly surprised at the tone of his reference to Mullah Muhammad, and was curious to know what his future behaviour would be so as to merit such expressions of pity and condemnation from his master. Not until I discovered his attitude that day towards the Bab did I realize the extent of his arrogance and blindness. I was standing together with other people outside the hall, and was able to follow the conversation of those who were within. Mullah Muhammad was seated on the left hand of the Wali Ad. The Bab was occupying a seat between them. Immediately after he had declared himself to be the promised one, a feeling of awe seized those who were present. They had dropped their heads in silent confusion. The pallor of their faces betrayed the agitation of their hearts. Mullah Muhammad, that one-eyed and white-bearded renegade, insolently remanded him, saying, "You wretched and immature lad of Shiraz, you have already convulsed and subverted Iraq. Do you now wish to arouse a like turmoil in Azerbaijan?" "Your honour," replied the Bab, "I have not come hither of my own accord. I have been summoned to this place." "Hold your peace," furiously retorted Mullah Muhammad, "you perverse and contemptible follower of Satan." "Your honour," the Bab again answered, "I maintain what I have already declared." The Nizamul Ulama thought it best to challenge his mission openly. "The claim which you have advanced," he told the Bab, is a stupendous one. It must needs be supported by the most incontrovertible evidence. The mightiest, the most convincing truth of the mission of the Prophet of God," the Bab replied, "is admittedly his own word. He himself testifies to this truth. Is it not enough for them that we have sent down to thee the book?" Which is a quotation from the Quran 29:51. "The power to produce such evidence has been given to me by God. Within the space of 2 days and 2 nights I declare myself able to reveal verses of such number as will equal the whole of the Quran. Describe orally, if you speak the truth," the Nizamul Ulama requested, "the proceedings of this gathering in language that will resemble the phraseology of the verses of the Quran, so that the Wali Ad and the assembled divines may bear witness to the truth of your claim." The Bab readily acceded to his wish. No sooner had he uttered the words, "In the name of God, the merciful, the compassionate, praise be to him who has created the heaven and the earth," than Mullah Muhammad Imam interrupted and called his attention to an infraction of the rules of grammar. "This self-appointed Qaim of ours," he cried in haughty scorn, "has at the very start of his address betrayed his ignorance of the most rudimentary rules of grammar." "The Quran itself," pleaded the Bab, "does in no wise accord with the rules and conventions current amongst men. The word of God can never be subject to the limitations of his creatures. Nay, the rules and canons which men have adopted have been deduced from the text of the word of God and are based upon it. These men have, in the very texts of that holy book, discovered no less than 300 instances of grammatical error, such as the one you now criticize. Inasmuch as it was the word of God, they had no other alternative except to resign themselves to his will." And a footnote here says, "If anyone should raise an objection to the grammar or syntax of these verses, this objection is vain, because the rules of grammar should be taken from the verses and not the verses written in compliance with the rules of grammar. There is no doubt that the master of these verses denied these rules, denied that he himself was ever aware of them." From the Persian Bayan, Volume 1, pages 45 to 6. He then repeated the same words he had uttered, to which Mullah Muhammad raised again the same objection. Shortly after, another person ventured to put this question to the Bab: "To which tense does the word Ishtartana belong?" In answer to him, the Bab quoted this verse from the Quran: "Far be the glory of thy Lord, the Lord of all greatness, from what they impute to him, and peace be upon his apostles, and praise be to God, the Lord of the worlds." Immediately after, he arose and left the gathering. And a footnote to this says, "And as for the Muslim accounts, those which we have before us do not bear the stamp of truth. They seem to be forgeries. Knowing what we do of the Bab, it is probable that he had the best of the argument, and that the doctors and functionaries who attended the meeting were unwilling to put upon record their own fiasco. From Dr. T. K. Chain's The Reconciliation of Races and Religions. The Nizamul Ulama was sorely displeased at the manner in which the meeting had been conducted. "How shameful," he was heard to exclaim later, "is the discourtesy of the people of Tabriz. What could possibly be the connection between these idle remarks and the consideration of such weighty, such momentous issues?" A few others were likewise inclined to denounce the disgraceful treatment meted out to the Bab on that occasion. Mullah Muhammad Imam Akhani, however, persisted in his vehement denunciations. "I warn you," he loudly protested, "if you allow this youth to pursue unhampered the course of his activities, the day will come when the entire population of Tabriz will have flocked to his standard. Should he, when that day arrives, signify his wish that all the ulamas of Tabriz, that the Wali Ad himself should be expelled from the city, and that he should alone assume the reins of civil and ecclesiastical authority, no one of you, who now view with apathy his cause, will feel able to oppose him effectually. The entire city, nay, the whole province of Azerbaijan, will on that day unanimously support him." The persistent denunciations of that evil plotter excited the apprehensions of the authorities of Tabriz. Those who held the reins of power in their grasp took counsel together as to the most effective measures to be taken to resist the progress of his faith. Some urged that in view of the marked disrespect which the Bab had shown to the Wali Ad in occupying his seat without his leave, and because of his failure to obtain the consent of the chairman of that gathering when he arose to depart, he, the Bab, should be summoned again to a like gathering and should receive from the hands of its members a humiliating punishment. Nasir-ed-Din Mirza, however, refused to entertain this proposal. Finally, it was decided that the Bab should be brought to the home of Mirza Ali Asghar, who was both the Sheikhul Islam of Tabriz and a Sayyid, and should receive at the hands of the governor's bodyguard the chastisement which he deserved. The guard refused to accede to this request, preferring not to interfere in a matter which they regarded as the sole concern of the ulamas of the city. But Sheikhul Islam himself decided to inflict the punishment. He summoned the Bab to his home, and with his hand 11 times applied the rods to his feet. That same year this insolent tyrant was struck with paralysis, and after enduring the most excruciating pain, died a miserable death. His treacherous, avaricious, and self-seeking character was universally recognized by the people of Tabriz. Notoriously cruel and sordid, he was feared and despised by the people who groaned under his yoke and prayed for deliverance. The abject circumstances of his death reminded both his friends and his opponents of the punishment which must necessarily await those whom neither the fear of God nor the voice of conscience can deter from behaving with such perfidious cruelty towards their fellow men. After his death, the functions of the Sheikhul Islam were abolished in Tabriz. Such was his infamy that the very name of the institution with which he had been associated came to be abhorred by the people. And yet his behavior, base and treacherous as it was only one instance of the villainous conduct which characterized the attitude of the ecclesiastical leaders among his countrymen towards the Bab. How far and how grievously have these erred from the path of fairness and justice! How contemptuously have they cast away the counsels of the prophet of God and the admonitions of the imams of the faith! Have not these explicitly declared that, quote, should a youth from Bani Hashim, the footnote says Hashim was the great-grandfather of Muhammad, be made manifest and summon the people to a new book and to new laws, all should hasten to him and embrace his cause? The quote ends here. Although these same imams have clearly stated that, again a quote, most of his enemies shall be the ulamas, end quote, yet these blind and ignorant people have chosen to follow the example of their leaders and to regard their conduct as the pattern of righteousness and justice. They walk in their footsteps, implicitly obey their orders, and deem themselves the people of salvation, the chosen of God, and the custodians of his truth. From Tabriz, the Bab was taken back to Shirik, where he was again entrusted to the keeping of Yahya Khan. His persecutors had fondly imagined that by summoning him to their presence they would, through threats and intimidation, induce him to abandon his mission. That gathering enabled the Bab to set forth emphatically, in the presence of the most illustrious dignitaries assembled in the capital of Azerbaijan, the distinguishing features of his claim, and to confute, in brief and convincing language, the arguments of his adversaries. The news of that momentous declaration, fraught with such far-reaching consequences, spread rapidly throughout Persia, and stirred again more deeply the feelings of the disciples of the Bab. It reanimated their zeal, reinforced their position, and was a signal for the tremendous happenings that were soon to convulse that land. No sooner had the Bab returned to Shirik than he wrote in bold and moving language a denunciation of the character and action of Haji Mirza Akazi. In the opening passages of that epistle, which was given the name of Khutbi-i-Kariye, which is literally the Sermon of Wrath, the author addresses the Grand Vizier of Muhammad Shah in these terms: O thou who hast disbelieved in God, and hast turned thy face away from his signs. That lengthy epistle was forwarded to Hujat, who in those days was confined in Tehran. He was instructed to deliver it in person to Haji Mirza Akazi. I was privileged to hear the following account from the lips of Baha'u'llah while in the prison city of Akka. Mullah Muhammad Ali Zanjani, soon after he had delivered that tablet to Haji Mirza Akazi, came and visited me. I was in the company of Mirza Masih-i-Nuri and a number of other believers when he arrived. He recounted the circumstances attending the delivery of the tablet, and recited before us the entire text, which was about 3 pages in length, and which he had committed to memory. The tone of Baha'u'llah's reference to Hujat indicated how greatly pleased he was with the purity and nobleness of his life, and how much he admired his undaunted courage, his indomitable will, his unworldliness, and his unwavering constancy. Chapter 19. The Mazindaran Upheaval, Part 1. In the same month of Shaban that witnessed the indignities inflicted upon the Bab in Tabriz, and the afflictions which befell Baha'u'llah and his companions in Nayala, Mullah Hussein returned from the camp of Prince Hamza Mirza to Mashhad, from which place he was to proceed 7 days later to Karbala, accompanied by whomsoever he might desire. The prince offered him a sum of money to defray the expenses of his journey, an offer that he declined, sending the money back with a message requesting him to expend it for the relief of the poor and needy. Abdul Ali Khan likewise volunteered to provide all the requirements of Mullah Hussein's intended pilgrimage, and expressed his eagerness to pay also the expenses of whomsoever he might choose to accompany him. All that he accepted from him was a sword and a horse, both of which he was destined to utilize with consummate bravery and skill in repulsing the assault of a treacherous enemy. My pen can never adequately describe the devotion which Mullah Hussein had kindled in the hearts of the people of Mashhad, nor can it seek to fathom the extent of his influence. His house in those days was continually besieged by crowds of eager people who begged to be allowed to accompany him on his contemplated journey. Mothers brought their sons, and sisters their brothers, and tearfully implored him to accept them as their most cherished offerings on the altar of sacrifice. Mullah Hussein was still in Mashhad when a messenger arrived bearing to him the Bab's turban and conveying the news that a new name, that of Sayyid Ali, had been conferred upon him by his master. "Adorn your head," was the message, "with my green turban, the emblem of my lineage, and, with the black standard unfurled before you, hasten to the Jaziri-i-Khadra and lend your assistance to my beloved Qudus." A footnote says that Jaziri-i-Khadra literally means the verdant isle. As soon as that message reached him, Mullah Hussein arose to execute the wishes of his master. Leaving Mashhad for a place situated at a farsang's distance from the city, he hoisted the black standard, placed the turban of the Bab upon his head, assembled his companions, mounted his steed, and gave his signal for their march to the Jaziri-i-Khadra. His companions, who were 202 in number, enthusiastically followed him. That memorable day was the 19th of Shaban in the year AH 1264, which is the 21st of July, AD 1848. Wherever they tarried, at every village and hamlet through which they passed, Mullah Hussein and his fellow disciples would fearlessly proclaim the message of the new day, would invite the people to embrace its truth, and would select from among those who responded to their call a few whom they would ask to join them on their journey. In the town of Nishapur, Haji Abdul Majid, the father of Badi, a footnote says the bearer of Baha'u'llah's tablet to Nasir-ud-Din Shah, who was a merchant of note, enlisted under the banner of Mullah Hussein. Though his father enjoyed an unrivaled prestige as the owner of the best-known turquoise mine in Nishapur, he, forsaking all the honours and material benefits that his native town had conferred upon him, pledged his undivided loyalty to Mullah Hussein. In the village of Miameh, 30 among its inhabitants declared their faith and joined that company. All of them, with the exception of Mullah Isa, fell martyrs in the fort of Sheikh Tabasi. Arriving at Chashmi Ali, a place situated near the town of Damghan and on the high road to Mazindaran, Mullah Hussein decided to break his journey and tarry there for a few days. He encamped under the shadow of a big tree by the side of a running stream. "We stand at the parting of the ways," he told his companions. "We shall await his decree as to which direction we should take." Towards the end of the month of Shawwal, 31st of August to the 29th of September, AD 1848, a fierce gale arose and struck down a large branch of that tree, whereupon Mullah Hussein observed, "The tree of the sovereignty of Muhammad Shah has, by the will of God, been uprooted and hurled to the ground." On the third day after he had uttered that prediction, a messenger, who was on his way to Mashhad, arrived from Tehran and reported the death of the sovereign. A footnote here says, Muhammad Shah died on the eve of the 6th of Shawwal, corresponding to the 4th of September, AD 1848. The following day, the company determined to leave for Mazindaran. As their leader arose to depart, he pointed in the direction of Mazindaran and said, "This is the way that leads to our Kabila. Whoever is unprepared for the great trials that lie before us, let him now repair to his home and give up the journey." Several times he repeated that warning, and as he approached Sabat Khu, explicitly declared, "I, together with 72 of my companions, shall suffer death for the sake of the well-beloved. Whoso is unable to renounce the world, let him now at this very moment depart, for later on he will be unable to escape." 20 of his companions chose to return, feeling themselves powerless to withstand the trials to which their chief continually alluded. The news of their approach to the town of Bafurush alarmed the Sayyidul Ulama. The widespread and growing popularity of Mullah Hussein, the circumstances attending his departure from Mashhad, the black standard which waved before him, above all, the number, the discipline, and the enthusiasm of his companions, combined to arouse the implacable hatred of that cruel and overbearing Mujtahid. He bade the crier summon the people of Bafurush to the masjid, and announced that a sermon of such momentous consequence was to be delivered by him that no loyal adherent of Islam in that neighborhood could afford to ignore it. An immense crowd of men and women thronged the masjid, saw him ascend the pulpit, fling his turban to the ground, tear open the neck of his shirt, and bewail the plight into which the faith had fallen. "Awake," he thundered from the pulpit, "for our enemies stand at our very doors, ready to wipe out all that we cherish as pure and holy in Islam. Should we fail to resist them, none will be left to survive their onslaught. He who was the leader of that band came alone one day and attended my classes. He utterly ignored me and treated me with marked disdain in the presence of my assembled disciples. As I refused to accord him the honors which he expected, he angrily arose and flung me his challenge. This man had the temerity, at a time when Muhammad Shah was seated upon his throne, and was at the height of his power, to assail me with so much bitterness. What excess is this stirrer-up of mischief, who is now advancing at the head of his savage band, will not commit, now that the protecting hand of Muhammad Shah has been suddenly withdrawn. It is the duty of all the inhabitants of Baha'i, both young and old, both men and women, to arm themselves against these contemptible wreckers of Islam, and by every means in their power to resist their onslaught. Tomorrow, at the hour of dawn, let all of you arise and march out to exterminate their forces." The entire congregation arose in response to his call. His passionate eloquence, the undisputed authority he exercised over them, and the dread of the loss of their own lives and property combined to induce the inhabitants of that town to make every possible preparation for the coming encounter. They armed themselves with every weapon which they could either find or devise, and set out at daybreak from the town of Baha'i, fully determined to face and slay the enemies of their faith and to plunder their property. As soon as Mullah Hussein had determined to pursue the way that led to Mazindaran, he immediately, after he had offered his morning prayer, bade his companions discard all their possessions. "Leave behind all your belongings," he urged them, "and content yourselves only with your steeds and swords, that all may witness your renunciation of all earthly things, and may realize that this little band of God's chosen companions has no desire to safeguard its own property, much less to covet the property of others." Instantly they all obeyed, and unburdening their steeds, arose and joyously followed him. The father of Badi was the first to throw aside his satchel, which contained a considerable amount of turquoise, which he had brought with him from the mine that belonged to his father. One word from Mullah Hussein proved sufficient to induce him to fling by the roadside what was undoubtedly his most treasured possession, and to cling to the desire of his leader. At a farsang's distance from Baha'i, Mullah Hussein and his companions encountered their enemies. A multitude of people, fully equipped with arms and ammunition, had gathered and blocked their way. A fierce expression of savagery rested upon their countenances, and the foulest imprecations fell unceasingly from their lips. The companions, in the face of the uproar of this angry populace, made as if to unsheath their swords. "Not yet," commanded their leader. "Not until the aggressor forces us to protect ourselves must our swords leave our scabbards." He scarcely uttered these words, and the fire of the enemy was directed against them. 6 of the companions were immediately hurled to the ground. "Beloved leader," exclaimed one of them, "we have risen and followed you with no desire except to sacrifice ourselves in the path of the cause we have embraced. Allow us, we pray you, to defend ourselves, and suffer us not to fall so disgracefully a victim to the fire of the enemy." "The time is not yet come," replied Mullah Hussein. "The number is as yet incomplete." A bullet immediately after pierced the breast of one of his companions, a Seyyid from Yazd, who had walked all the way from Mashhad to that place, and who ranked among his staunchest supporters. At the sight of that devoted companion fallen dead at his feet, Mullah Hussein raised his eyes to heaven and prayed, "Behold, O God, my God, the plight of thy chosen companions, and witness the welcome which these people have accorded thy loved ones. Thou knowest that we cherish no other desire than to guide them to the way of truth, and to confer upon them the knowledge of thy revelation. Thou hast thyself commanded us to defend our lives against the assaults of the enemy. Faithful to thy command, I now arise with my companions to resist the attack which they have launched against us." A footnote here says, "No one is to be slain for unbelief, for the slaying of a soul is outside the religion of God, and if anyone commands it, he is not and has not been of the Bayan, and no sin can be greater for him than this." From the Bayan, see Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, 1889, Article 12, pages 227 to 8. Unsheathing his sword and spurring on his charger into the midst of the enemy, Mullah Hussein pursued with marvelous intrepidity the assailant of his fallen companion. His opponent, who was afraid to face him, took refuge behind a tree, and holding aloft his musket, sought to shield himself. Mullah Hussein immediately recognized him, rushed forward, and with a single stroke of his sword cut across the trunk of the tree, the barrel of the musket, and the body of his adversary. The astounding force of that stroke confounded the enemy and paralyzed their efforts. All fled, panic-stricken in the face of so extraordinary a manifestation of skill, of strength, and of courage. This feat was the first of its kind to attest to the prowess and heroism of Mullah Hussein, a feat which earned him the commendation of the Bab. Qudus likewise paid his tribute to the cool fearlessness which Mullah Hussein displayed on that occasion. He is reported to have quoted, when informed of the news, the following verse of the Koran: "So it was not ye who slew them, but God who slew them, and those shafts were God's, not thine. He would make trial of the faithful by a gracious trial from himself. Verily God heareth, knoweth. This befell, that God might also bring to naught the craft of the infidels." I myself, when in Tehran in the year A.H. 1265, AD 1848-9, a month after the conclusion of the memorable struggle of Sheikh Tabasi, heard Mirza Ahmad relate the circumstances of this incident in the presence of a number of believers, among whom were Mirza Muhammad Hussein-i Hakami-i Kirmani, Haji Mullah Ismail-i Farahani, Mirza Habibullah-i Isfahani, and Syed Muhammad-i Isfahani. When at a later time I visited Khorasan and was staying at the home of Mullah Sadiq-i Khorasani in Mashhad, where I had been invited to teach the cause, I asked Mirza Muhammad-i Furuhi, in the presence of a number of believers, among whom were Nabil-i Akbar and the father of Badi, to enlighten me regarding the true character of that amazing report. Mirza Muhammad emphatically declared, "I myself was a witness to this act of Mullah Hussein. Had I not seen it with my own eyes, I never would have believed it." In this connection, the same Mirza Muhammad related to us the following story. After the engagement of Vasqaz, when Prince Mirti Kuli Mirza was completely routed and had fled barefooted from the face of the companions of the Bab, the Amir Nizam severely rebuked him. I have charged you," he wrote him, "with a mission of subduing a handful of young and contemptible students. I have placed at your disposal the army of the Shah, and yet you have allowed it to suffer such a disgraceful defeat. What would have befallen you, I wonder, had I entrusted you with the mission of defeating the combined forces of the Russian and Ottoman governments?" The prince thought it best to entrust a messenger with the fragments of the barrel of that same rifle, which was cleft in twain by the sword of Mullah Hussein, and to instruct him to present them in person to the Amir Nizam. "Such is," was his message to the Amir, "the contemptible strength of an adversary who, with a single stroke of his sword, has shattered into 6 pieces the tree, the musket, and its holder." So convincing a testimony of the strength of his opponent constituted, in the eyes of the Amir Nizam, a challenge which no man of his position and authority could afford to ignore. He resolved to curb the power which, by so daring an act, had sought to assert itself against his forces. Unable, in spite of the overwhelming number of his men, to defeat Mullah Hussein and his companions fairly and honorably, he meanly resorted to treachery and fraud as instruments for the attainment of his purpose. He ordered the prince to affix his seal to the Koran and pledge the honor of his officers, that they would henceforth abstain from any act of hostility towards the occupants of the fort. By this means he was able to induce them to lay down their arms and to inflict upon his defenseless opponents a crushing and inglorious defeat. Such a remarkable display of dexterity and strength could not fail to attract the attention of a considerable number of observers whose minds had remained as yet untainted by prejudice or malice. It evoked the enthusiasm of poets who, in different cities of Persia, were moved to celebrate the exploits of the author of so daring an act. Their poems helped to diffuse the knowledge and to immortalize the memory of that mighty deed. Among those who paid their tribute to the valor of Mullah Hussein was a certain Riza Kuli Khan-i-Lali Bashi, who, in the Tariq-i-Nasiri, lavished his praise on the prodigious strength and the unrivaled skill which had characterized that stroke. I ventured to ask Mirza Muhammad-i Furuhi whether he was aware that in the Nasikut Tawarikh mention had been made of the fact that Mullah Hussein had, in his early youth, been instructed in the art of swordsmanship, that he had acquired his proficiency only after a considerable period of training. This is sheer fabrication, affirmed Mullah Muhammad. I have known him from his childhood, and have been associated with him as a classmate and friend for a long time. I have never known him to be possessed of such strength and power. I even deemed myself superior in vigour and bodily endurance. His hand trembled as he wrote, and he often expressed his inability to write as fully and as frequently as he wished. He was greatly handicapped in this respect, and he continued to suffer from its effects until his journey to Mazindaran. The moment he unsheathed his sword, however, to repulse that savage attack, a mysterious power seemed to have suddenly transformed him. In all subsequent encounters, he was seen to be the first to spring forward and spur on his charger into the camp of the aggressor. Unaided, he would face and fight the combined forces of his opponents, and would himself achieve the victory. We who followed him in the rear had to content ourselves with those who had already been disabled and were weakened by the blows they had sustained. His name alone was sufficient to strike terror into the hearts of his adversaries. They fled at mention of him. They trembled at his approach. Even those who were his constant companions were mute with wonder before him. We were stunned by the display of his stupendous force, his indomitable will, and complete intrepidity. We were all convinced that he had ceased to be the Mullah Hussein whom we had known, and that in him resided a spirit which God alone could bestow. This same Mirza Muhammad-i Farughi related to me the following. Mullah Hussein had no sooner dealt this memorable blow to the adversary than he disappeared from our sight. We knew not whither he had gone. His attendant, Kamba Ali, alone could follow him. He subsequently informed us that his master threw himself headlong upon his enemies and was able, with a single stroke of his sword, to strike down each of those who dared assail him. Unmindful of the bullets that rained upon him, he forced his way through the ranks of the enemy and headed for Bafarush. He rode straight to the residence of the Sayyidul Ulama, thrice made the circuit of his house, and cried out, "Let that contemptible coward, who has incited the inhabitants of this town to wage holy warfare against us, and has ignominiously concealed himself behind the walls of his house, emerge from his inglorious retreat. Let him by his example demonstrate the sincerity of his appeal and the righteousness of his cause. Has he forgotten that he who preaches a holy war must needs himself march at the head of his followers, and by his own deed kindle their devotion and sustain their enthusiasm?" The voice of Mullah Hussein drowned the clamour of the multitude. The inhabitants of Bafarush surrendered and soon raised the cry, "Peace, peace!" No sooner had the voice of surrender been raised than the acclamations of the followers of Mullah Hussein, who at the moment were seen galloping towards Bafarush, were heard from every side. The cry, "Ya Sahibuz Saman," which they shouted at the top of their voices, struck dismay into the hearts of those who heard it. The companions of Mullah Hussein, who had abandoned the hope of again finding him alive, were greatly surprised when they saw him seated erect upon his horse, unhurt and unaffected by the fierceness of that onset. Each reverently approached him and kissed his stirrups. On the afternoon of that day, the peace which the inhabitants of Bafarush had implored was granted. To the crowds which had gathered about him, Mullah Hussein spoke these words: "O followers of the Prophet, and Shias of the Imams of his faith, why have you risen against us? Why deem the shedding of our blood an act meritorious in the sight of God? Did we ever repudiate the truth of your faith? Is this the hospitality which the Apostle of God has enjoined his followers to accord to both the faithful and the infidel? What have we done to merit such condemnation on your part? Consider, I alone, with no other weapon than my sword, have been able to face the rain of bullets which the inhabitants of Bafarush have poured upon me, and have emerged unscathed from the midst of the fire with which you have besieged me. Both my person and my horse have escaped unhurt from your overwhelming attack. Except for the slight scratch which I received on my face, you have been powerless to wound me. God has protected me and willed to establish in your eyes the ascendancy of his faith.